The buzzing of Richard Iverson's phone interrupted the tense silence of the boardroom, where 12 executives sat awaiting his final verdict on the acquisition that would cement Iverson Industries as the dominant shipping and logistics company in the Eastern Hemisphere. His mother's name flashed on the screen, and he silenced it with an irritated swipe. It was the fourth time she'd called in the past hour. "Gentlemen, excuse me for a moment," Richard said, rising from his chair. At 34, he commanded the respect of men twice his age, having transformed his late father's respectable shipping business into a global empire. "Review the final terms among yourselves. I'll return shortly." Once in the hallway, he called his mother back. "Mom, I'm in the middle of closing the Meridian deal." "What's so urgent?" Richard Anthony Iverson. Alina's voice carried the practiced authority of a woman who had raised 4 children while managing charitable foundations across 3 continents. "You've canceled dinner 3 times this month." "I've made arrangements for tonight at Alois, 7 o'clock, and before you start listing excuses, I've already cleared it with Margot." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. His executive assistant had betrayed him. "Mom, I've invited someone to join us." The pause that followed was weighted with implication. "Mom, we've talked about this. I don't need you to, Jennifer Anderson. She's the new director at the Children's Museum. Lovely girl. Harvard Art History. Her father runs that sustainable agriculture venture in California." Richard exhaled slowly. "Mom, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not interested in 7 o'clock, Richard. Don't be late." The call ended with a decisive click. Richard stared at his phone, contemplating the multiple ways he could avoid this dinner. His mother's matchmaking attempts had grown more frequent since his younger sister's wedding 6 months ago. As the last unmarried Iverson child, he'd become the sole focus of Alina's matrimonial ambitions. Returning to the boardroom, Richard directed his full attention to finalizing the Meridian deal. By 5:30, contracts were signed, congratulatory handshakes exchanged, and champagne poured. Richard should have been elated. The acquisition represented everything he'd worked toward for years. Instead, he was distracted by the looming dinner engagement. "Margot," he called to his assistant as he returned to his office. "Why didn't you warn me about my mother's plans?" Margot smiled unapologetically. "Because you would have asked me to make up an excuse, and I'm running out of creative emergencies. Besides, when was the last time you had dinner with your mother, or anyone outside of a business context?" Richard glared at her, but there was no real anger behind it. Margot had been with him since he took over the company 8 years ago. She was one of the few people who could speak to him with complete candor. "I've had your navy Brioni suit pressed. Car will be waiting at 6:30. She handed him a folder. "Background on Jennifer Anderson in case you need conversation starters." "You're enjoying this," he accused. "Tremendously," she admitted. "Now go get ready. Alina Iverson is not a woman who tolerates tardiness, even from her billionaire son." At precisely 6:55, Richard entered Alois, Boston's most exclusive restaurant. The maitre d' recognized him immediately. "Mr. Iverson, your mother has already arrived. This way, please." Alina Iverson sat regally at a corner table, her silver hair styled perfectly, her posture impeccable. Beside her sat a woman Richard didn't recognize, definitely not Jennifer Anderson, whose photo he'd glanced at in the folder Margot had prepared. "Richard, darling," Alina rose to kiss his cheek. "You remember Julia Abbott?" From the hospital foundation, Richard masked his surprise as he extended his hand to the woman. "Of course. Lovely to see you again." Julia Abbott was not what Richard had expected. In her early 30s, she had warm hazel eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled. Her chestnut hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and she wore a simple emerald dress that complemented her fair skin. "Mr. Iverson," she said, her handshake firm. I believe we met briefly at the Foundation Gala last year. Richard had no recollection of meeting her, but he nodded politely as he took his seat. Please, call me Richard. Richard, she repeated with a slight smile. Your mother has told me so much about you. I'm sure she has, he replied dryly, giving Alina a pointed look. Julia has been instrumental in developing our new pediatric wing, Alina explained. She's a wizard at strategic planning. The hospital's fundraising has increased 40% under her direction. Impressive, Richard said, studying Julia with new interest. She didn't fit the profile of the women his mother usually ambushed him with, typically socialites or daughters of her friends, women who viewed marriage to a billionaire as a career advancement. Your mother exaggerates, Julia said. The entire Foundation team deserves credit. The waiter arrived with menus and Richard used the interruption to assess the situation. I thought Jennifer Anderson was joining us tonight. Alina looked up innocently from her menu. Did I say Jennifer? I meant Julia. Poor Jennifer came down with something. Last-minute substitution. Richard didn't believe it for a second. His mother had planned this, probably fabricating Jennifer Anderson entirely. He caught Julia's eye and saw a flicker of amusement there. She knew exactly what Alina was doing. So, Julia, Richard said after they'd ordered. How did my mother coerce you into this dinner, Richard? Alina admonished. Julia laughed, a genuine sound that caught Richard off guard. Actually, she told me quite directly that her son needed to be reminded there's life outside shipping containers, and that I was just the person to do it. She promised excellent food and conversation, with no expectations. How could I refuse? Richard found himself smiling despite his irritation. And has the evening lived up to those promises so far? The food hasn't arrived yet, but the conversation is promising, Julia replied with a directness that matched his own. As the appetizers arrived, Alina expertly guided the conversation, drawing out connections between Richard's work and Julia's. Richard learned that Julia had spent 5 years in corporate strategic development before transitioning to nonprofit work, that she had grown up in Seattle, and that she had a master's in public administration from Columbia. What made you leave the corporate world? Richard asked, genuinely curious. Julia considered the question. I was good at what I did, but it wasn't fulfilling. I wanted to use my skills for something more meaningful than increasing shareholder value. Richard felt an unexpected twinge of defensiveness. Some might argue that creating jobs and economic stability is meaningful. Of course it is, Julia agreed, surprising him again. But it wasn't enough for me personally. I needed to see a more direct impact. That's not a judgment on those who find purpose in business. Alina excused herself to the ladies' room, leaving Richard alone with Julia for the first time. I should apologize for my mother's manipulation, Richard said once Alina was out of earshot. Julia smiled. No need. She told me exactly what she was doing. She's worried about you, you know. Richard raised an eyebrow. Did she share that in the 10 minutes between telling you about this dinner and your arrival? Actually, I've known your mother for 2 years through the foundation. We've had many conversations. She thinks you work too hard. I run a global company. Hard work comes with the territory. Julia nodded. True. But even CEOs deserve personal lives. When was the last time you did something purely for enjoyment? Richard opened his mouth to answer, then realized he couldn't recall. Work had consumed him since his father's death. The company had been on the brink of failure then, and turning it around had required single-minded dedication. That focus had become habit. I thought so, Julia said, reading his silence correctly. And what about you? Richard countered. All work and no play. I make time for life, she said simply. Last weekend I hiked Mount Monadnock. The weekend before I took my niece to her first ballet. Small things, but they matter. Alina returned before Richard could respond, but Julia's words lingered in his mind. He found himself paying closer attention to her, as the main course arrived the way she listened intently when others spoke, how she used her hands expressively when describing her work, the genuine enthusiasm in her voice when discussing the hospital's impact. By dessert, Richard was surprised to realize he was enjoying himself. The conversation had ranged from business strategies to art exhibitions to travel experiences, without the awkward pauses or forced pleasantries he'd expected. Julia was intelligent and articulate, with a dry humor that occasionally caught him by surprise. "So, Richard," Alina said as she sipped her coffee, "Julia tells me the foundation is looking for corporate partners for their new initiative. Wouldn't Iverson Industries be perfect?" Richard recognized his mother's not-so-subtle attempt to ensure continued contact between him and Julia. Normally, he would deflect such an obvious maneuver, but he found himself considering it seriously. "What kind of initiative?" he asked Julia. "We're developing a program to bring advanced medical care to underserved ports where your ships dock," Julia explained. "Many of these communities lack basic healthcare infrastructure. We've designed mobile clinics that could potentially be transported on cargo vessels like yours." Richard leaned forward, his business mind engaging. "That's actually brilliant. Utilizing existing shipping routes to deliver healthcare solutions would be cost-effective and efficient." "Exactly," Julia nodded, her eyes brightening. "We've been struggling with the logistics, though. Having expertise from someone in global shipping would be invaluable." "I'd be interested in hearing more details," Richard said, surprising himself with his enthusiasm. "Perhaps we could arrange a meeting with your team." "I'd like that," Julia replied, and Richard detected genuine pleasure in her smile. As the evening concluded, Richard insisted on seeing both women to their cars. Alina left first with a knowing smile and a whispered, "You're welcome," in Richard's ear. Alone with Julia beside her modest sedan, Richard found himself reluctant to end the evening. "Thank you for being a good sport about all this," he said. "I enjoyed myself more than I expected to," Julia admitted. "Your reputation doesn't do you justice." Richard raised an eyebrow. "My reputation? Boston's most eligible and unobtainable billionaire. The man who lives and breathes business. The ruthless shipping magnate," Julia listed with a teasing smile. Richard winced. "That sounds terrible." "It's not entirely accurate," Julia said. "You're obviously dedicated and driven, but there's more there. Alina sees it. I think I caught glimpses tonight." Richard found himself wanting to know what she saw, but he didn't ask. Instead, he said, "About that foundation initiative, I meant what I said. I'd like to explore potential collaboration." "I'll email you the proposal tomorrow," Julia promised, opening her car door. "And Richard, even if Iverson Industries doesn't end up partnering with us, I'm glad we met tonight." After she drove away, Richard stood in the restaurant parking lot, replaying the evening in his mind. For the first time in years, he'd spent hours not thinking about acquisitions or profit margins or competitor strategies. It felt strange, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "You're welcome. She's perfect for you." Richard shook his head but couldn't suppress a smile. Alina Iverson was nothing if not persistent, and maybe just maybe she wasn't entirely wrong this time. The next morning, Richard arrived at his office earlier than usual. He'd slept poorly, his mind returning to the dinner conversation whenever he drifted toward sleep. Something about Julia Abbott had unsettled his carefully ordered world. "You look thoughtful," Margot observed as she brought in his coffee. "How was dinner with your mother and the museum director?" "There was no museum director," Richard replied, accepting the steaming mug. "My mother fabricated Jennifer Anderson. We were joined by Julia Abbott from the hospital foundation instead." Margot's eyebrows shot up. "Alina switched candidates at the last minute. That's new." "It appears she's elevating her game," Richard said dryly. "And how was Miss Abbott? Another society princess seeking a wealthy husband. Actually, no. Richard found himself reluctant to discuss Julia. She was interesting. The foundation is working on a mobile healthcare initiative that might align with our operations. She's sending over a proposal today. Margot gave him a knowing look. A business angle, smart woman. It's a legitimate project, Richard said defensively. Forward it to me as soon as it arrives, and clear my schedule for lunch tomorrow. Should I make a reservation somewhere? Margot asked innocently. That won't be necessary. Richard turned to his computer, effectively ending the conversation. Julia's email arrived at 9:47 a.m., professional and concise, with a detailed proposal attached. Richard spent an hour reviewing it, impressed by the thoroughness of the plan. The concept was innovative yet practical, using existing shipping routes to deliver health care to remote coastal communities where Iverson vessels already docked. The foundation would provide medical staff and equipment. They needed transportation and logistical support. Almost without thinking, Richard picked up his phone and called Julia directly rather than going through proper channels. "This is Julia Abbott," she answered, her voice clear and professional. "Julia, it's Richard Iverson. I just reviewed your proposal." "That was fast," she said, sounding pleased. "What did you think?" "I think it has merit, but I have questions about implementation. Are you available for lunch tomorrow?" There was a slight pause. "Business lunch to discuss the proposal or another of your mother's matchmaking attempts?" Richard found himself smiling at her directness. "Strictly business, though I can't promise my mother won't somehow find out and take credit," Julia laughed. "In that case, yes, I'm available." Where and when, they arranged to meet at a small bistro near the foundation offices. As Richard ended the call, he realized he was looking forward to seeing her again with an enthusiasm that went beyond professional interest. He pushed the thought aside and focused on preparing for his morning meetings. The following day, Richard arrived at the bistro 10 minutes early. He'd chosen the restaurant for its quiet atmosphere and privacy, ideal for business discussions. When Julia entered, he was struck again by her natural elegance. She wore a simple navy pantsuit with a pale blue blouse, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. Professional, but not severe. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting," she said as she slid into the seat across from him. "Not at all," Richard replied. "I appreciate you making time on short notice." They ordered quickly, and Richard pulled out a tablet with notes on her proposal. "I've reviewed the concept in detail. It's innovative and aligns well with some of our corporate social responsibility goals. I have some thoughts on how we could expand the reach." Julia leaned forward, clearly interested. "I'd love to hear them." For the next 30 minutes, they discussed the proposal, exchanging ideas and identifying potential challenges. Richard found himself energized by Julia's quick mind and practical approach. She wasn't intimidated by him and didn't hesitate to challenge his assumptions when appropriate. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into this," Richard said as they finished their meals. "But I'm curious why approach Iverson Industries specifically. There are other shipping companies that could provide similar support." Julia considered her response. "Honestly, 3 reasons. First, your routes cover exactly the regions we're targeting. Second, you have a reputation for operational excellence, which means reliable scheduling. And third," she hesitated. "Yes," Richard prompted. "Your mother suggested it," Julia admitted with a smile. "She said you needed a project that would remind you why you built this company in the first place." Richard sat back, surprised. "Did she now? Was she wrong?" Julia asked quietly. Richard found himself considering the question more seriously than he'd intended. The past few years had been focused on expansion, acquisition, and market dominance. His father's vision of connecting communities through commerce had become secondary to growth metrics and shareholder returns. "No," he finally said. "She wasn't wrong." Julia nodded, as if his answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. So, what's next? Is this something Iverson Industries might consider? It's something I'm personally interested in pursuing, Richard said. I'll need to bring it to my executive team, but I think we can make this work. I'd like to schedule a formal presentation for next week. That would be wonderful, Julia said, her face lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. The foundation board will be thrilled. As they wrapped up lunch, Richard found himself reluctant to end their meeting. I should get back to the office, he said, glancing at his watch. But I've enjoyed this discussion. So have I, Julia agreed as they walked outside. You're not exactly what I expected, Richard Iverson. What did you expect? He asked, curious. Someone more ruthless, cold. The business world talks about you as if you're a machine. Richard winced. Not the most flattering portrayal. No, Julia agreed, but inaccurate, I think. Your mother always described you differently passionate, principled, just too focused on work to remember why you started in the first place. Richard walked Julia to her car, struck by how comfortable their conversation felt. My mother seems to have discussed me quite thoroughly with you. She's proud of you, Julia said simply. But worried too. Parents are complicated that way. As she prepared to leave, Richard found himself saying, Would you be interested in dinner Friday to celebrate our potential partnership? Julia gave him a measured look. Is that the only reason? Richard appreciated her directness. No, he admitted. I enjoy talking with you. It's refreshing. Then yes, Julia said with a smile, I'd like that. As Richard returned to his office, he realized he was smiling. Margot noticed immediately. Good lunch meeting, she asked knowingly. Very productive, Richard replied neutrally. Schedule a meeting with the executive team for tomorrow morning. I want to discuss a potential corporate social responsibility initiative with the Boston Memorial Hospital Foundation. Of course, Margot said. And should I clear your calendar for Friday evening as well? Richard shot her a look. How did your mother called? Twice. She wanted to know how lunch went with that lovely Abbott girl and to remind you that Fridays are perfect for dinner and the symphony. Richard groaned. My mother is incorrigible, but effective, Margot observed. I haven't seen you this energized about a project or a woman in years. Richard chose not to respond to the latter observation. Just schedule the executive meeting, please. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and preparations. Richard threw himself into developing the foundation partnership with the same intensity he applied to major acquisitions. His executive team was initially skeptical, but became increasingly supportive as Richard outlined the business case alongside the humanitarian benefits. By Friday, a preliminary agreement was in place. Richard found himself checking the clock repeatedly as the day progressed, anticipating his dinner with Julia with an eagerness that surprised him. At 6, he left the office earlier than he had in months and headed home to change. He'd chosen Sorellina, an upscale Italian restaurant known for its intimate atmosphere. When Julia arrived, Richard was momentarily speechless. She wore a simple burgundy dress that complemented her figure without being ostentatious, her hair loose around her shoulders. You look beautiful, he said as they were seated. Thank you, Julia replied with a warm smile. I thought about wearing my foundation fundraising attire, much more sequins and drama, but decided that might be overkill for pasta. Richard laughed, appreciating her humor. I've never been good at the social niceties that come with dating, he admitted. Business negotiations I understand. Personal conversations are more challenging. Let's start with something easy then, Julia suggested. Tell me about your first ship. Richard blinked, surprised by the question. How did you know about that? Your mother mentioned you built model ships as a boy. I assumed you remembered your first real one. Richard nodded, a memory surfacing. The Ellie Me, named after my mother. It was a small container vessel, barely noteworthy by industry standards, but it was the first acquisition I made after taking over from my father. He paused, recalling the pride he'd felt. We still use it for regional routes in Southeast Asia. What made that purchase special? Julia asked, genuinely interested. Richard considered the question. It represented possibility. My father's company was struggling when he died. That purchase was the first step in turning things around. I remember walking the deck after the papers were signed, thinking about all the places it would go, the goods it would carry, the people it would employ. That's beautiful, Julia said softly. That connection to purpose, that's what drives you, isn't it? The conversation flowed easily through dinner, ranging from childhood memories to professional challenges to favorite books. Richard found himself sharing stories he rarely discussed: his father's struggle with the business in his final years, Richard's determination to preserve his legacy, the pressure of supporting thousands of employees and their families. Julia listened attentively, offering insights without judgment. In turn, she spoke of her own journey growing up in a family that valued public service, her initial foray into corporate work, and her eventual realization that nonprofit management allowed her to combine her business acumen with meaningful impact. I've talked to dozens of potential corporate partners, Julia said as they shared dessert, but you're the first CEO who personally reviewed our proposal and championed it from the beginning. Most delegate to their community relations teams. It resonated with me, Richard said simply. And I'm not just talking about the business case. Their eyes met, and Richard felt a connection that went beyond professional admiration or physical attraction. There was an understanding between them, a recognition of shared values despite their different worlds. As they left the restaurant, Richard suggested a walk along the waterfront. The night was clear and mild for early autumn, the harbor lights reflecting on the water. I got the board's preliminary approval today, Richard told her as they walked. We're prepared to commit 3 vessels to the program initially, with potential expansion based on the pilot results. Julia stopped walking and turned to face him. That's incredible. I expected maybe 1 ship to start. This will allow us to serve twice as many communities in the first year. Without thinking, Richard reached out and took her hand. Your passion for this project is contagious. Julia glanced down at their joined hands, then back up to meet his eyes. Is this still about the foundation partnership, Richard? No, he admitted. Though I am genuinely excited about that too. She smiled and squeezed his hand. Good, because while I'm thrilled about the partnership, I'm also very interested in getting to know Richard the man, not just Richard the billionaire CEO. I'd like that, he said softly. Their first kiss was gentle and brief, there on the moonlit harbor walk. As Richard drove Julia home afterward, he felt more at peace than he had in years. Something was shifting in his carefully ordered life, and for once, he wasn't trying to control every variable. At Julia's apartment building, he walked her to the door. I'd like to see you again, soon. I'd like that too, she replied. Though I should warn you, your mother called me this morning to ask how I felt about sailing. I suspect she's already planning our next date. Richard laughed. I apologize in advance for whatever scheme she's concocting. Don't, Julia said. I'm beginning to think Billionaire Iverson might be the wisest matchmaker in Boston. With a final kiss goodnight, Richard returned to his car. As he drove home, his phone rang. Billionaire's name appeared on the display. Hello, Mother, he answered, unable to keep the amusement from his voice. Richard, darling, Billionaire said breezily. How was your evening? I suspect you already know. I may have spoken with Julia briefly this afternoon, Billionaire admitted. She mentioned you're moving forward with the foundation project. I'm proud of you. Thank you, Richard said. Though I know the project isn't the only thing you're interested in. Can a mother not want her son's happiness? Billionaire asked innocently. Julia is special, Richard. I knew it the first time I met her at the foundation. She reminds me of your father in some ways, that same quiet determination, that belief in doing good while doing well. Richard felt a lump in his throat at the mention of his father. She's unlike anyone I've met, he admitted. Then don't let your work keep you from pursuing this, Eleanor advised. Some opportunities don't come around twice. After ending the call, Richard reflected on his mother's words. For years, he'd been focused solely on building the business, convinced that personal relationships would distract from his goals. Now, he wondered if he'd been wrong, if connection, not just achievement, was what had been missing. Over the next few weeks, Richard and Julia fell into a comfortable rhythm. They met for dinners, spent weekends exploring Boston's museums and parks, and worked together on finalizing the foundation partnership. Richard found himself looking forward to their time together, rearranging meetings and delegating tasks that he would previously have handled personally. Margot noticed the change. "I don't mean to alarm you," she said one morning as she handed him his schedule, "but you've left the office before 7 p.m. 5 times in the past 2 weeks. The board might think you've been replaced by a doppelganger." Richard smiled ruefully. "Very funny." "Is everything set for the foundation announcement next week?" "All arranged," Margot confirmed. "Press releases drafted, venue secured. Eleanor has approved the guest list, though she did suggest you might want to bring a +1. "Of course she did," Richard said, but there was no irritation in his tone. The official announcement of the partnership between Iverson Industries and the Boston Memorial Hospital Foundation became a major media event. Richard found himself genuinely proud as he stood before cameras and reporters, explaining how Iverson ships would help deliver medical care to underserved coastal communities. Julia stood beside him at the podium, articulate and passionate as she outlined the initiative's goals. Watching her, Richard felt a surge of admiration that went beyond her professional capabilities. In the few weeks they'd been seeing each other, he discovered layers to her that continued to surprise him: her wry sense of humor, her patience with difficult people, her ability to remain optimistic while being pragmatic. At the reception following the announcement, Eleanor approached them, beaming with satisfaction. "You two make quite the team," she observed. "The press is eating it up, corporate giant partners with foundation to save lives. It's a wonderful story." "It's more than a story, Mom," Richard said. "This program will make a real difference." "I know, darling," Eleanor patted his arm. "That's why it matters. By the way, Julia, will you be joining us for the family dinner on Sunday? Richard's sister is coming in from Chicago with the baby." Richard started to intervene, concerned that Eleanor was pushing too hard, but Julia answered smoothly. "I'd be delighted, Eleanor. Thank you for including me." Later, when they had a moment alone, Richard apologized. "My mother is subtle as a freight train. You don't have to come to family dinner if it's too much too soon." Julia considered him thoughtfully. "Is it too much for you?" Richard realized it wasn't. "No," he said honestly. "I want you there. I just don't want you to feel pressured." "Richard," Julia said, taking his hand, "I'm falling in love with you. Meeting your family isn't pressure, it's a privilege." Richard felt something expand in his chest at her words. "I'm falling in love with you too," he admitted, the truth of it washing over him like a wave. "It's terrifying and wonderful all at once," Julia laughed softly. "The mighty Richard Iverson, terrified, completely," he confirmed, pulling her closer. "You've upended my carefully ordered world, Julia Abbott." "Good," she whispered before kissing him. "It needed upending." Sunday dinner with the Iverson family proved to be chaotic, warm, and revealing. Richard's sister Catherine, her husband Michael, and their 6-month-old daughter Emma had arrived from Chicago. His brother Thomas and his wife Sophia joined from their home in the Boston suburbs with their twin boys. His youngest sister, Elizabeth, flew in from London where she worked as an architect. Julia fit seamlessly into the family dynamic, holding baby Emma with natural ease, discussing sustainable construction with Elizabeth, and drawing out Thomas's quiet wife in conversation. Richard watched her throughout the evening, seeing his family through her eyes. "She's wonderful," Catherine murmured to Richard as they stood in the kitchen, ostensibly helping with dessert but actually watching Julia laugh with their mother in the living room. "Mom outdid herself this time." "Don't let her take all the credit," Richard replied. Julia agreed to that first dinner knowing exactly what Mom was doing. "Smart woman," Catherine approved. "How serious is this, Richie?" Richard considered the question. "Very," he admitted. "I've never felt this way before." Catherine squeezed his arm. "Good. You deserve happiness, brother. You've carried the weight of Dad's company on your shoulders for too long." After dinner, as the family dispersed to various parts of Aline's spacious home, Richard and Julia slipped out to the garden. The autumn evening was cool but pleasant, the sky clear and star-filled. "Your family is wonderful," Julia said as they walked among Aline's prized roses. "They love you very much." "They seemed quite taken with you as well," Richard observed. "Even Thomas's boys, who are generally suspicious of all new adults," Julia smiled. "Children appreciate authenticity. No point trying to impress them, they see right through it." They stopped by a stone bench and Richard turned to face her. "Julia, these past few weeks have been transformative. I've spent years convinced that success meant sacrifice, that I couldn't build the company and have a personal life simultaneously. And now," Julia asked softly, "now I realize what I was missing. You've shown me that purpose and connection aren't opposing forces, they strengthen each other." Richard took both her hands in his. "I love you, Julia. I know it's fast, but I love you too," she interrupted, her eyes shining. "And yes, it's fast, but it's also right." Richard kissed her then, trying to convey through touch what words couldn't adequately express: gratitude, wonder, commitment, love. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Move in with me," he said impulsively. Julia pulled back slightly, surprised. "What?" "I want to see you every day," Richard continued, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. "I want to wake up with you, have coffee together, hear about your day. I know we could keep dating, take things slowly, but I don't want to waste time when I'm certain about how I feel." Julia studied his face as if searching for doubt. Finding none, she smiled slowly. "Your mother will be insufferable, you know. She'll take full credit," Richard laughed. "Let her. She earned it." "Yes," Julia said simply. "Yes, I'll move in with you." From the house came the sound of a door opening, and Aline's voice called out, "Richard, Julia." "Dessert is ready. Perfect timing as always, Mom," Richard called back. As they walked hand in hand toward the house, Richard felt a sense of rightness that had been missing from his life for too long. His mother had seen what he needed before he recognized it himself, not just any partner, but specifically Julia, with her blend of compassion and pragmatism, her ability to challenge him without confrontation, her commitment to making a difference. The next 3 months passed in a blur of activity. Julia moved into Richard's penthouse, overlooking Boston Harbor, bringing warmth and life to spaces that had previously been merely functional. The foundation partnership launched successfully, with the first Iverson vessel delivering medical supplies and personnel to a coastal community in Southeast Asia. Richard found himself delegating more, trusting his executive team with day-to-day operations while he focused on strategic direction, and increasingly, on building a life with Julia. They established routines together: morning coffee on the balcony, weekly dinners with friends or family, quiet evenings discussing their respective work. It wasn't always perfect. They had disagreements about Richard's workaholic tendencies, about Julia's occasional reluctance to accept help, about whose turn it was to load the dishwasher. But they learned to navigate conflicts with respect and humor, strengthening their relationship through resolution rather than avoidance. At the Foundation's holiday gala, Richard watched Julia work the room, gracious and focused as she spoke with donors and board members. Alina appeared at his side, elegant in midnight blue. "She's extraordinary," his mother observed. "Yes, she is," Richard agreed. "Thank you, Mom." Alina raised an eyebrow. "For what exactly?" "For being persistent. For seeing what I couldn't see myself." Alina patted his arm affectionately. "A mother knows. Your father would have adored her, you know. He always said true success wasn't measured by profit margins but by the lives you touched. Julia understands that instinctively." Later that night, as they returned home, Richard made a decision. He'd been carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. Now he realized there was no such thing as perfect timing, only perfect certainty. As they stood on their balcony, the harbor lights twinkling below, Richard took Julia's hands. "What is it?" she asked, sensing his intensity. "I've been thinking about something my mother said tonight about how my father defined success. For years after he died, I thought success meant saving his company, expanding it, making it unassailable. I poured everything into that goal." Julia nodded, listening intently. "But these past months with you have shifted my perspective," Richard continued. "I now understand what he really meant. Success is meaningless without someone to share it with, someone who challenges you to be better, who reminds you why the work matters in the first place." Richard reached into his pocket and withdrew the small velvet box. Julia's eyes widened as he dropped to one knee. "Julia Abbott, you've transformed my life in ways I never imagined possible. You've shown me that loving someone doesn't diminish focus, it enhances it. I want to spend my life with you, building something that matters, creating a legacy of purpose and connection." He opened the box, revealing the vintage emerald and diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Julia's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "With all my heart, yes." As Richard slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Breaking the kiss, he glanced at the screen and laughed. "What is it?" Julia asked. Richard showed her the text from Alina. "Well, did she say yes?" Julia laughed through her tears. "How did she know?" "Mother's intuition," Richard suggested. "Or more likely, she's been plotting this since the moment she introduced us." "We should call her," Julia said, admiring the ring on her finger. "In a minute," Richard replied, pulling Julia back into his arms. "First, I want to enjoy this moment with my fiancé." As they stood together overlooking the city, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 6 months ago, he'd reluctantly agreed to a dinner arranged by his meddling mother, convinced it would be a waste of time. Instead, it had been the beginning of the most important relationship of his life. Alina had seen in Julia exactly what Richard needed, not just a partner, but someone who shared his values while broadening his perspective. Someone who complemented his strengths and gently challenged his weaknesses. Someone who reminded him daily that success wasn't measured in acquisitions or profits, but in lives improved and connections forged. Richard sent a quick reply to his mother. She said yes, you were right all along. Alina's response came seconds later. Of course I was. I'll expect you both for brunch tomorrow. We have a wedding to plan. Richard showed Julia the message and they both laughed. She's unstoppable, Julia said fondly. A force of nature, Richard agreed. But in this case, I'm profoundly grateful for her interference. Julia leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. So am I. 6 months later, Richard stood at the altar of Boston's historic Old North Church, watching as Julia walked toward him on her father's arm. She was radiant in a simple but elegant gown, her smile bright enough to illuminate the entire sanctuary. In the front pew, Alina dabbed at her eyes, satisfaction and joy evident in her expression. Beside her sat Richard's siblings and their families, along with Julia's parents and brother. As Julia reached him and took his hands, Richard felt a sense of completion he'd never experienced before. The minister's words washed over him commitment, partnership, love in good times and challenging ones, but Richard's focus remained on Julia's face, on the promise of their future together. When they exchanged vows and rings, Richard's voice remained steady despite the emotion filling his chest. This was right. This was exactly where he was meant to be. At the reception, Alina approached the newlyweds, her eyes still damp. "You make a beautiful couple," she said, embracing them both. "I couldn't be happier." "Thank you, Mom," Richard said sincerely, "for everything, including your matchmaking schemes," Julia added with a smile. "Sometimes a mother knows best," Alina said with a wink. "Though I must admit, even I didn't expect it to work quite this well." As Alina moved away to greet other guests, Richard pulled Julia onto the dance floor. "My mother will be insufferable now," he murmured as they began to waltz. "She'll expect matchmaking credit at every anniversary." "And she deserves it," Julia replied, following his lead effortlessly. "Though I maintain I would have fallen in love with you regardless of how we met." "Is that so?" Richard asked, twirling her gently. "Absolutely," Julia confirmed. "Some connections are inevitable, Richard. Your mother just accelerated the timeline." Richard considered this as they danced, surrounded by friends and family. Perhaps Julia was right, perhaps they would have found each other eventually through the foundation partnership or some other connection. But he was grateful they hadn't needed to wait, that his mother's intuition had brought them together when it did. As the evening progressed, Richard found moments to observe Julia from across the room laughing with his niece, deep in conversation with his brother, embracing her own parents. Each glimpse reinforced the certainty in his heart. This woman, this partnership, this love, this was the foundation of true success. Later, as they prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a 2-week sailing trip through the Greek islands, Alina's suggestion, naturally, Julia pulled Richard aside for a private moment. "I have something for you," she said, pressing a small package into his hands. Richard unwrapped it curiously to find a compass, antique but perfectly restored, nestled in a wooden box. Engraved on the inside of the lid were the words, "To navigate our journey together." "It's beautiful," Richard said, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "You've built an empire that connects the world," Julia said softly. "Now we're building a life together. I thought we could use a compass for this new journey." Richard kissed her, overwhelmed by emotion. "I love you, Mrs. Iverson." "And I love you," she replied with a smile. "Even when your mother meddles." "Especially then," Richard laughed. As they said their goodbyes and departed amid a shower of rose petals, Richard held Julia's hand firmly in his. The compass was tucked safely in his pocket, a perfect symbol for this new chapter. His mother had set them on this course with her determined matchmaking, but the journey ahead was theirs to navigate together. 1 year later, Richard stood in the doorway of their home office, watching as Julia finished a video call with the foundation team. The initiative they'd started together had expanded to serve 20 coastal communities across 3 continents, with plans for further growth. Julia now divided her time between the foundation and consulting for Iverson Industries' corporate social responsibility programs, bringing her unique perspective to both organizations. "Good news?" Richard asked as she closed her laptop. "Very," Julia confirmed with a smile. "The clinic in Indonesia just delivered its first baby, a healthy girl named Ellie, after your mother." Richard laughed. "Mom will be ecstatic, speaking of whom, she's expecting us for dinner at 7. Julia glanced at her watch. "We should get ready then, but first." She took Richard's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I have something to tell you." Richard's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Are you?" Julia nodded, her eyes shining. 12 weeks. Doctor confirmed it yesterday." Richard pulled her into his arms, joy surging through him. "A baby," he whispered, awestruck. "We're having a baby." "Your mother's going to claim credit for this too, you know," Julia teased through happy tears. "Let her," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "She deserves it." That evening, as they shared their news with Alina, Richard watched his mother's face transform with joy. She embraced Julia with tender care, then turned to Richard with tears in her eyes. "This is everything I've ever wanted for you," she said softly. "A partner who truly sees you and now a family of your own." Richard hugged his mother tightly. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for knowing what I needed before I did." Alina patted his cheek affectionately. "That's what mothers do, darling. We see the best in our children, even when they're too stubborn to see it themselves." As they celebrated with champagne, sparkling water for Julia, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a reluctant dinner date. His mother's persistence had changed the course of his life, bringing him not just love but a renewed sense of purpose. Julia caught his eye across the room and smiled, that warm, knowing smile that still made his heart race. In her, he had found not just a wife but a partner in the truest sense, someone who challenged him to be better, who reminded him daily why his work mattered, who brought joy and balance to a life that had been consumed by ambition. Alina had been right all along. Julia was perfect for him not because she was flawless, but because their strengths and weaknesses complemented each other, creating something stronger than either could achieve alone. As Richard raised his glass in a toast to their future, he silently thanked his mother once more for her meddling ways. Alina Iverson had forced a dinner date on her reluctant billionaire son, never expecting she would actually choose right, but she had. Perfectly, wonderfully right.